Chapter 1: The First Quiet Encounter. At first, the painting does not arrive as a spectacle. It arrives as a hush. Before it becomes a story, before it becomes a legend, before the mind supplies the familiar name of Lady Godiva and all the centuries of retelling that cling to it like old dust on cathedral stone, it is simply a figure in stillness, moving and yet suspended, exposed and yet impossibly composed. John Collier does not present her as if she has burst into history. He presents her as if history has paused for her. The great white horse advances with measured dignity, its body powerful, luminous, almost ceremonial, while upon it sits a woman who does not flaunt herself and does not defend herself. She is not turned toward us in performance. She is turned inward, head gently lowered, face grave with the knowledge of what must be endured. Her long hair falls like a private veil, and in that gesture of concealment the painting discovers its true language, not scandal, not seduction, but restraint. The red and gold trappings of the horse bring a richness that would, in another painting, announce triumph or pageantry, yet here they deepen the sense of solemn burden, as if nobility itself has become a weight she must carry into public view. Around her, the city recedes. Architecture is present, but only faintly, only enough to remind us that this act happens among human beings, among laws, among customs, among unseen eyes. And it is precisely that invisibility that makes the image so haunting. Collier gives us a public act wrapped in private silence. He lets the air around her remain unbroken. He withholds noise. There is no crowd pressing inward, no mocking face, no obvious witness, no vulgar interruption of the sacred tension that holds the scene together. The result is that we do not feel invited to stare at her, we feel invited to lower our own gaze and enter the moral weather of the moment. This is why the painting lingers long after first sight. It refuses the easy habits of looking. It asks whether a body can be painted without being possessed by the viewer, whether vulnerability can exist without humiliation, whether courage can take a form so quiet that it almost resembles surrender. The answer, in Collier's hands, is yes, and that yes is painted not as argument but as atmosphere. The skin is pale not in the cold language of display but in the living language of fragility. The horse seems to understand her, carrying her not as an object but as a charge entrusted to it. Even the downward angle of her face seems full of intelligence, as though she has already passed beyond embarrassment into another region of consciousness where personal discomfort has become secondary to compassion. This first encounter, then, is not merely visual. It is ethical. We stand before the painting and begin to recognize that it is organizing our response. It does not allow the careless appetite of the eye to remain careless. It slows us. It dignifies what could so easily have been degraded. It transforms legend into interiority. And in that transformation, it does something even more unsettling. It reveals how rare true dignity is in art, and how much discipline it takes, both for painter and viewer, to preserve it. The room around the painting may be modern, the museum walls neutral, the world beyond the gallery full of speed and bright distraction, yet this image keeps its own time. It asks us to enter a medieval street imagined through a Victorian soul and rediscovered by a contemporary mind that is still uncertain whether sacrifice is admirable, foolish, beautiful, or tragic. Perhaps it is all of these at once. Perhaps that is why we remain before her. She does not explain herself. She does not ask for applause. She does not seem certain of being remembered. She only continues, one quiet step at a time, through a silence that feels larger than the city itself. In that silence, the painting begins its work on us. We notice that the most powerful images are not always the loudest, that what unsettles us most deeply is often not aggression but composure, not violence but willing exposure, not the cry but the breath held before it. And so the first quiet encounter becomes less an introduction than an initiation. We are no longer merely looking at a famous subject from the past. We are standing before a visual meditation on the cost of conscience. We are meeting a woman who is legendary and yet strangely near, elevated by myth and yet rendered with enough tenderness to remain human. The painting opens like a doorway into that difficult human region where shame, mercy, courage, and beauty do not cancel one another, but travel together, slowly, under a dim and watchful sky. Chapter 2: The World It Emerged From. To understand why this image carries such a peculiar gravity, one must drift back into the worlds that made it possible, not just the 11th century Coventry of the legend, but the 19th century England that revived, reshaped, and cherished it. The historical Lady Godiva was an Anglo-Saxon noblewoman associated with Leofrach, Earl of Mercia, and with religious patronage in Coventry. The earliest chroniclers speak of her generosity and status, but not of the famous ride itself. The tale of the naked passage through town emerged later, growing across centuries until it became a moral legend about power, pleading, taxation, obedience, pity, and the strange theatre of public sacrifice. Later accounts added further elements, including the command that townspeople remain indoors and, much later still, the figure remembered as Peeping Tom, whose glance turned the story toward temptation and punishment. By the Victorian age, the legend had become fertile ground for art because it united precisely the themes that age found irresistible: chivalry, medievalism, feminine virtue, social conscience, and the dangerous border between sanctified beauty and illicit looking. The Herbert Museum itself preserves a wider tradition of Godiva imagery, evidence of how deeply Coventry and Victorian culture embraced her as both civic emblem and poetic heroine, while the story's literary revival after Alfred Lord Tennyson's 1842 poem helped secure its emotional texture for painters who sought not just anecdote but atmosphere. In other words, Collier inherited not a simple story but a layered inheritance already shaped by chroniclers, pageants, sermons, poems, and civic memory. Source. Yet the painting belongs equally to the late Victorian imagination, and that world was itself suspended between confidence and unease. Britain in the 1890s stood at the height of imperial authority, industrial power, and public display, yet beneath its polished surfaces lay anxieties about morality, gender, class, modernity, and desire. It was an age that loved codes of dress, codes of propriety, codes of conduct, and therefore also loved symbolic scenes in which those codes were tested. Medieval subjects offered distance enough to imagine purity and conflict without directly indicating the present, but the past was never merely the past. It was a mirror arranged at an angle. When Victorian artists painted legendary women, they were not simply reconstructing old worlds, they were examining their own age's obsessions through the safer veil of history. Lady Godiva was especially potent because she allowed artists to paint nudity under the protection of virtue. Her body could appear in public art, yet her intention remained morally elevated. She was not Venus emerging from mythic foam. She was conscience on horseback. That distinction mattered greatly in a culture fascinated by beauty but deeply nervous about its consequences. The Victorians were masters of the respectable disguise, and the Godiva legend gave them one of the most elegant disguises imaginable: the unclothed body transformed into a sermon on altruism. Still, beneath that moral frame there remained unresolved tensions. Was the image to be admired as spiritual courage, or secretly consumed as spectacle? Was the viewer invited into reverence, or tempted into the very voyeurism the legend condemned? These were not accidental questions. They were the electricity in the wire. The late 19th century loved paintings that could hold both nobility and danger in the same visual field, and Collier understood that a legend survives precisely because it refuses to settle into one meaning. His world also inherited strong artistic traditions from Classicism, the pre-Raphaelite revival, and the growing culture of public exhibitions. Museums, academies, illustrated publications, and urban audiences had made the act of viewing itself central to modern life. People gathered to look, to judge, to praise, to gossip, to classify. In such a world, a painting about the ethics of looking had unusual force. Coventry's medieval tolls and cloistered streets may seem distant from London galleries and imperial boulevards, yet the underlying problem remained alive. What does society demand from the individual, and what does the crowd do when one body becomes the site of a moral demand? The legend of Godiva promised relief from oppressive taxes, but the Victorian viewer also sensed another taxation, less economic but no less real: the taxation of the self by public scrutiny, by social judgment, by the relentless demand to appear respectable. That is why this apparently ancient story felt contemporary to Collier's audience. It addressed power without needing parliament, shame without needing confession, desire without needing explicit transgression. The medieval city, dimly remembered, offered a stage on which the drama of civilization itself could be played. One woman pleads, one ruler refuses, one body bears the cost, one community is tested, one forbidden glance threatens to corrupt the whole moral design. These are the elemental shapes from which enduring myths are made. And so the world from which the painting emerged was not only a historical sequence of facts but a dense emotional climate, monastic memory in the distance, Victorian conscience in the foreground, a city preserving its patron legend, artists mining the past for symbols equal to their own inward conflicts. From such a climate Collier drew his image, and when we stand before it now, we stand at the meeting point of many centuries of need, the need to tell a story of mercy, the need to dignify exposure, the need to believe that a noble act can pass through the marketplace and remain undefiled. Chapter 3: The Artist's State of Mind. John Collier belonged to that fascinating late Victorian generation that could paint society portraits with poise and then turn, with equal seriousness, toward ancient heroines and morally charged scenes from legend. He was known for portraits and dramatic historical subjects, worked within currents touched by pre-Raphaelite and classical influence, studied under Edward Poynter, and moved in the orbit of a culture that valued aesthetic refinement, technical finish, and the expressive portrayal of the human form. Sources describing his career emphasize both his long exhibiting life and his attraction to figures drawn from history and myth, suggesting an artist interested not merely in likeness but in the psychological theater of identity. Such a painter was uniquely prepared for Lady Godiva because the subject demands more than anatomy and more than costume. It demands moral calibration. Too much sensual emphasis, and the work collapses into theatrical eroticism. Too much piety, and it stiffens into lifeless allegory. Too much anecdotal detail, and the silence is broken. What Collier seems to have brought to the subject is a mind attentive to thresholds, between portrait and myth, between flesh and symbol, between admiration and danger. We cannot know every tremor of Collier's private thoughts as he painted, but the painting itself allows us to imagine the discipline of feeling behind it. He must have understood from the beginning that Lady Godiva is not only a woman in a story. She is a test of the painter's gaze. How does one paint nudity without surrendering the subject to appetite? How does one make beauty visible yet keep it answerable to character? These are not merely formal questions. They are questions about the conscience of art. The late Victorian studio was never just a room of brushes and canvases, it was also a chamber of decisions about what could be seen, how it might be seen, and in whose moral language it would be translated. Collier, close to traditions that admired ideal form, would have known the prestige of the nude in European art, but he also lived in a culture where the nude had to justify itself anew before modern publics. Lady Godiva gave him an opportunity both dangerous and exquisite. He could paint the uncovered human body, but only by placing it inside an act of pity and courage. Yet the excuse alone would not save the painting. He had to earn its dignity stroke by stroke. That is why the face matters so much. It is why posture matters. It is why the horse matters. Every element must collaborate in the refusal of vulgarity. Her bowed head tells us immediately that she does not inhabit the scene as a performer. Her seat upon the horse avoids triumphal grandeur. Her hair functions not as decorative flourish alone but as a moral device, preserving modesty while acknowledging exposure. Even the atmosphere around her seems designed to protect the inwardness of the moment from becoming merely public drama. One senses an artist who does not want to humiliate his subject, and that restraint may be the most revealing sign of his state of mind. He appears to paint with sympathy, but not sentimentality, with admiration, but not sentimental worship, with technical confidence, but under the pressure of an ethical question he knows cannot be solved through polish alone. Perhaps Collier was drawn to characters who stand at moments of irreversible action because such moments allow painting to reach beyond description into destiny. A portrait records presence, but a legendary scene can record decisions. Lady Godiva is not simply being. She is doing, though the doing is quiet. She has already accepted the burden of the act, and Collier catches her within that inward acceptance rather than at the more obvious instant of public shock. This choice suggests a painter interested in consciousness. He seems less fascinated by the crowd's reaction than by the subject's composure before it. That composure is not easy. It is controlled vulnerability, and perhaps that is what moved him most deeply. Victorian culture often staged women as emblems of virtue or danger. Collier seems to reach toward a rarer complexity, allowing Godiva to remain beautiful without making beauty the point, and heroic without making heroism loud. In this sense, his state of mind may have been one of deliberate stilling. He quiets what could be sensational. He simplifies what could be anecdotal. He paints not the legend in all its theatrical expansion but the instant of inward gravity at its heart. To choose such a focus is to reveal one's allegiance as an artist. It says, I am less interested in what the crowd saw than in what she carried. I am less interested in punishment and curiosity than in resolve. I am less interested in the scandal of the ride than in the solitude of the rider. There is, too, a certain tenderness in the white horse, whose presence softens the scene without weakening it. This is not incidental. Animals in painting often function as emotional translators, and here the horse's calm, physical authority offers a kind of mute companionship. It shares her burden. It moves without panic. It lends the scene a ceremonial steadiness. Such choices suggest that Collier's imagination was attuned to grace under strain. His Lady Godiva is not defiant in the modern sense, not rebellious in gesture, not sharpened by anger. She is grave, almost prayerful. That gravity may tell us something about the artist's own seriousness. He paints as though beauty should still answer to the soul. He paints as though the atmosphere can carry conviction more deeply than rhetoric. He paints as though the most moving human states are those in which dignity survives ordeal without announcing itself. And perhaps that is why the work remains persuasive. It is not merely a product of technical skill or literary fashion. It feels like the expression of an artist who believed that painting could still preserve a moral interior, could still reveal the moment when a human being consents to pain for the sake of others, and could still do so without violating the mystery of that consent. Chapter 4: The Presence Within the Painting. If we remain long enough before the canvas, the woman in it begins to step away from legend and into presence. She is still Lady Godiva, still inseparable from the centuries of narration that have clothed and unclothed her in turns, but she also becomes someone stranger and more intimate than a historical or literary name. She becomes a consciousness passing through space. Collier gives her enough specificity to feel embodied and enough reserve to remain unknowable. This is a delicate achievement. Many painted heroines are all emblem and no life, others are all personality and no symbolic reach. Godiva here is poised between those extremes. She is not generalized into an abstract virtue, yet neither is she reduced to a dramatic actress caught in a costume piece. Her face is quiet, almost withdrawn, and in that withdrawal something profoundly human enters the image. We sense not emptiness but inward speech, the kind that never reaches the mouth. She appears to be enduring her own thoughts, measuring herself against what must be done, perhaps listening to the silence of the street, perhaps hearing the weight of unseen doors closed out of obedience or pity. The city around her fades because her interior world has become the true setting of the scene. That is what presence means here, not simply occupying the picture plane, but generating a field of feeling around oneself so complete that the environment becomes secondary. There is, too, a tension in her posture that keeps the painting alive. She is composed, but not at ease. She sits upright, but not proudly. Her body is visible, yet the body does not seem offered. It seems born. This distinction changes everything. The exposed form in art is often a form arranged for delight, for admiration, for mythic idealization, or for narrative vulnerability. Here it is all of those and none of those. It is a form submitted to necessity. Her modesty, preserved partly by her hair and partly by her bearing, does not erase the fact of exposure, it transforms the meaning of exposure. We begin to understand that nakedness in the painting is not the opposite of dignity. It is the condition through which dignity must travel. The white horse intensifies this transformation. It carries her like a visible conscience, a living pedestal that moves instead of standing still. White in art so often signals purity or sacrifice, and while such symbols can become stale when overread, here the color feels earned because it participates in the painting's emotional architecture. The horse's pale body echoes her own vulnerability while also lending her strength she cannot publicly display. It is muscle beside mercy, flesh beside resolve. And the decorative red and gold harnesses bring another nuance. They do not merely embellish. They remind us that she is noble, that this is not anonymous suffering but suffering undertaken by one accustomed to rank. Public shame, or what resembles it, becomes sharper when borne by someone whom society expects to remain protected by status. In this way the painting subtly stages a reversal. Privilege becomes the vehicle of sacrifice. Her nobility does not shield her from humiliation, it makes the renunciation more luminous. As we continue to look, the absent figures begin to matter almost as much as the visible ones. There is no peeping Tom here, no cluster of townspeople pressing toward the spectacle, no obvious architecture of judgment. This omission is one of Collier's most intelligent acts. By withholding the watching crowd, he spares Godiva from becoming trapped inside the viewer's appetite for narrative excitement. More importantly, he forces us to reckon with our own role. If there are few figures in the painted street, then we, standing before the canvas, become the ones who complete the scene. We are the possible witnesses, the possible intruders, the ones who must decide how to look. This gives her presence an almost disarming force. She is not merely present to us, she makes us present to ourselves. Do we look with sympathy, with curiosity, with embarrassment, with aesthetic admiration, with covert hunger, with reverence? The painting does not accuse, but neither does it absolve. It simply holds its silence until our own looking becomes audible within us. That may be the deepest reason the figure comes alive. She is not animated by theatrical gestures. She is animated by the moral pressure she exerts upon the beholder. A lesser painting would have asked only whether we find her beautiful. This painting asks whether beauty can remain innocent in a public gaze. It asks whether a human being can be seen without being consumed. It asks whether the line between witness and violator is as clear as we might wish. And yet, for all these heavy questions, the figure does not harden into philosophy. She remains touchingly mortal. Her lowered eyes suggest fatigue as much as courage. Her youthfulness suggests risk. Her fragility suggests that noble acts are not performed by abstract virtues but by bodies that tremble, flush, endure weather, hear footsteps, and feel cold. Presence, then, is not grandeur. It is nearness. We feel how alone she is, and that aloneness enlarges her until she fills the canvas not by scale but by inward force. She seems to carry the city's silence in her own breathing. She seems to know that what is happening cannot be undone. She seems to accept that dignity is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move through fear without surrendering one's soul to it. That is why she remains with us. She does not dominate the painting like a conqueror. She inhabits it like a conscience. Chapter 5 are symbols that speak without words. Some paintings tell their meanings openly, as if every object were a sentence waiting to be read. Others allow symbols to breathe more gently, to work through mood rather than declaration. Collier's Lady Godiva belongs to the latter kind. Its symbols do not clamor. They accumulate. They deepen the silence until it begins to speak for itself. The most immediate of these signs is the contrast between exposure and concealment. Her hair, flowing over the body that social law would name vulnerable, becomes more than a physical detail. It is nature intervening where society cannot. Clothes have been surrendered, but the self is not abandoned. Hair, which in so many traditions signifies beauty, sexuality, vitality, even vanity, is here transfigured into modesty. It becomes an instinctive garment, a veil not stitched by civilization but offered by the body itself. The symbolism is subtle yet profound. What is most intimate becomes protection, what might attract the gaze becomes the means of resisting it. In this transformation the painting discovers an emotional paradox that gives it much of its power. The very features that might render Godiva vulnerable are also those that preserve her moral wholeness. Nothing is simple in such an image. Beauty both exposes and shelters. The body both invites sight and rebukes it. Modesty does not erase embodiment, it dignifies it. Then there is the white horse, moving steadily beneath her. In legend and art, the horse often carries meanings of vitality, rank, and instinctive power, but here its whiteness cannot be ignored. White can be innocent, ritual, sacrifice, sanctity, or even ghostliness. In this scene it feels like all of these at once. The horse is magnificent, yet not wild. It channels power into obedience, just as Godiva channels personal fear into purpose. Together rider and horse form a symbolic union between vulnerability and strength. She could not make this passage on foot with the same visual meaning. To ride is to remain elevated and exposed simultaneously, dependent on an animal's movement yet required to maintain composure above it. The saddle and trappings complicate matters further. Their red and gold accents declare status, wealth, ceremonial dignity. They remind us that Godiva is no peasant martyr dragged unwillingly into spectacle. She is a noble woman acting from privilege against the burden that privilege has helped sustain. Gold glimmers like the structure of worldly power, red hints at sacrifice, courage, even the pulse of life itself. These colors do not shout, but they deepen the painting's moral ambiguity. The tools of rank are still present, yet they serve an act of renunciation. Splendor accompanies self-exposure. One does not cancel the other. That tension is part of the painting's intelligence. Her lowered head is another silent symbol, perhaps the most moving of all. Lowered eyes can signify humility, sorrow, prayer, shame, inward concentration, or refusal to engage with a threatening world. Collier leaves the gesture slightly open, and that openness matters. If her gaze met ours directly, the painting would become confrontational. If her face turned theatrically away, it might seem melodramatic. Instead, he gives us a downcast look that contains many emotional possibilities at once. She may be gathering strength. She may be refusing the marketplace the satisfaction of mutual recognition. She may be listening to the private voice that tells a person how to continue when dignity is all that remains. That ambiguity allows the gesture to expand beyond its immediate narrative role. It becomes a symbol of inwardness itself, of the soul leaning away from spectacle and toward conscience. The background, too, speaks through understatement. The city is present but subdued, a suggestion of walls and streets rather than a fully narrated environment. This recession of setting is meaningful. It tells us that the external world, though historically essential, is not the true subject. The true subject is what happens when an individual conscience enters public space. By muting the city, Collier makes the psychological landscape more vivid. The town becomes every town. The street becomes every place where a human being must endure the eyes or expectations of others. Even the absence of the onlookers becomes symbolic. The legend depends on witnesses, real or forbidden, yet the painting's restraint implies that the most consequential spectators may be invisible: society, morality, memory, and the viewer standing here now. The silence of the street suggests obedience, perhaps compassion, but it also magnifies the possibility of violation. One hidden glance could corrupt the whole atmosphere. Thus emptiness itself becomes a sign of tension. And finally there is the body, which in this painting is never merely a body. It is a moral threshold. Flesh in art has always been burdened with meanings imposed from outside: desire, fertility, shame, beauty, weakness, temptation, mortality. Collier neither rejects nor fully surrenders to these inheritances. He lets the body remain flesh, soft, luminous, mortal, while insisting, through composition and mood, that flesh can carry an idea without becoming abstract. Lady Godiva's body symbolizes neither crude sensuality nor disembodied sanctity. It symbolizes the indivisibility of personhood, the fact that every moral act must pass through the visible, fragile reality of the human form. There are no heroic armor plates here, no saintly halos, no legal documents in hand, no grand gestures. Her entire argument to the world is made through presence alone. That is why the symbols in this painting continue speaking after language fails. They speak of a world in which courage may look like softness, in which power may ride with bowed heads, in which beauty may refuse possession, and in which the most unforgettable protest may happen not through noise but through a body moving in silence across the threshold between the private self and the public eye. Chapter 6: Other visions of the same idea. No great image exists alone for long. Once a subject enters cultural memory, it begins to multiply. Other painters approach it, other writers reshape it, other ages emphasize new aspects of it, and gradually one realizes that what we call a theme is really a conversation unfolding across generations. Lady Godiva belongs to precisely such a conversation. Herbert's own collection bears witness to it, preserving multiple works tied to the Godiva story, from paintings by Victorian artists to depictions of Coventry processions that kept the legend visibly alive in civic life. This matters because Collier's painting was never created in a vacuum. He was painting into an already populated field, a field of prior images, literary echoes, and public expectations. Tennyson's poem helped renew the legend for the 19th century, while artists such as Edwin Landseer, Alfred Woolmer, Marshall Claxton, and others offered their own visions of Godiva, sometimes devotional, sometimes dramatic, sometimes more explicitly narrative, sometimes more entangled with local identity and pageantry. In this wider family of images, the same central act can become prayer, spectacle, civic icon, romantic medievalism, or moral allegory depending on the artist's temperament and the audience's hunger. What distinguishes Collier is the degree to which he simplifies in order to intensify. Other interpretations of Godiva often lean more visibly into narrative apparatus, the city more fully described, the dramatic anticipation of the ride, the emotional theater of prayer or decision, or the presence of those community structures from which the act derives its significance. In some visions the legend becomes almost processional, inseparable from civic ritual and collective memory. In others it becomes a romantic medieval tableau, richly textured and emotionally legible in the manner beloved by 19th century historicist art. But Collier narrows the frame toward an inward drama. He pares away secondary incidents and lets the legend hover close to the threshold of reverie. This restraint aligns him with a broader late Victorian tendency to invest historical and legendary subjects with psychological weight rather than merely anecdotal charm. We may think here of artists of neighboring sensibility, such as Waterhouse or Draper, who also transformed literary or mythic women into figures of mood and inward tension, though each did so in distinct ways. Yet Collier's Godiva remains unusually quiet even within that company. She is less enchantress than Conscience, less a dream figure than a burdened presence. In comparing her with other artistic treatments of women in legend, whether medieval saints, classical heroines, or Arthurian figures, we notice how often female beauty in 19th century art is made to carry contradictory expectations. She must be visually compelling yet morally legible, vulnerable yet idealized, emotionally resonant yet symbolically serviceable. Collier accepts those demands but resists their most obvious theatrics. He does not need the accessories of melodrama because the moral paradox of the scene already contains sufficient force. There is also the wider comparison between depictions of Godiva that emphasize voyeurism and those that refuse it. The legend itself, especially in later forms, invites the drama of the forbidden observer, Peeping Tom becoming the embodiment of corrupt sight. Some retellings cannot resist that tension and build their energy around it. Collier, by contrast, largely subtracts that energy from the visible frame. In doing so, he alters the viewer's experience. Instead of watching a woman being watched, we watch a woman crossing a silence that our own gaze threatens to disturb. The difference is subtle but decisive. It shifts the burden from narrative excitement to ethical introspection. Other artists may situate Godiva within a more elaborate visual economy of spectatorship, but Collier makes spectatorship itself strangely lonely. The absent watchers intensify our awareness that we might become the very thing the legend distrusts. This is one reason his version feels more modern than many of its companions. It internalizes the conflict. We do not merely observe the clash between virtue and temptation somewhere in the painted town, we experience that clash within the act of viewing. Beyond Godiva specifically, one might compare Collier's approach to a much longer artistic tradition of noble female figures whose exposure is interpreted through sacrifice, martyrs, penitence, allegories of truth, heroines undergoing trial. Yet Lady Godiva is not exactly any of these. She is secular and legendary, aristocratic rather than humble, active rather than punished, and the purpose of her ordeal is social mercy rather than private redemption. That makes her singular. She occupies a rare intersection of civic myth, feminine virtue, political plea, and visual danger. Other artworks about sacrifice often dramatize pain directly: chains, flames, wounds, tears, or visible oppression. Godiva's pain is subtler. It lies in exposure without spectacle, action without guarantee, moral conviction without the comfort of applause. Collier understands that this subtler suffering may be artistically richer than overt torment. He paints the idea not at its noisiest but at its most concentrated. The more one compares, the more one sees that each version of Lady Godiva reveals the needs of its maker and its moment. A city may need a patron legend. A poet may need a heroine of purity. A public may need an acceptable pretext for contemplating the nude. A painter may need a subject through which to reconcile beauty and seriousness. Collier seems to have needed, or at least recognized, something more exacting, a subject through which the ethics of seeing could themselves become the hidden theme. In that sense, his Lady Godiva converses not only with other Godivas but with every artwork that asks what it means to behold a vulnerable figure honorably. His answer is not perfect, because no such answer can be perfect. The danger remains. But it is precisely his awareness of the danger that gives the work its lasting dignity. Among the many visions of the same idea, his may be the one that most fully understands that the true drama is not only on the rider's path through Coventry, but in the space between the image and the eye that receives it. Chapter 7: What it reveals about human nature. If the painting endured only because it was beautiful, it would not remain so quietly troubling. Beauty alone rarely disturbs for long. What endures is recognition, and what we recognize in Lady Godiva is not merely a legendary act but a pattern of human nature that has never disappeared. The story begins with suffering distributed unequally across a community. Taxes fall heavily. Power is insulated. One person close to power pleads on behalf of those who cannot compel mercy for themselves. Already the legend touches a nerve that civilization never fully outgrows, the relation between privilege and compassion. Most people do not surrender comfort willingly. Most institutions do not soften merely because suffering exists. Someone must decide to feel what does not directly wound them. Lady Godiva, whether understood historically, poetically, or symbolically, becomes the figure of that decision. She allows another's burden to enter her own life so completely that she risks personal humiliation for collective relief. Human nature rarely produces such gestures in pure form. More often we admire them from a distance, uncertain whether they are noble or excessive, practical or futile, saintly or naive. That uncertainty is part of the painting's emotional truth. It knows that altruism can unsettle us because it exposes how carefully we guard ourselves. Yet the painting also reveals a darker pattern, our hunger to look, to know, to witness what should perhaps remain protected. The later addition of Peeping Tom to the legend is not accidental folklore. It is psychology in narrative form. The forbidden glance exists because the human mind is drawn toward the threshold, toward what is hidden, toward the moment when another person's privacy becomes vulnerable to our curiosity. Collier's decision to omit Tom from the visible scene does not erase this truth, it intensifies it. Without the explicit sinner in the frame, the temptation becomes diffuse, redistributed into the viewer's own consciousness. We begin to understand that voyeurism is not merely a gross act committed by an obvious villain leaning from a shuttered window. It is a subtler habit of the mind, the tendency to convert another person's ordeal into our own experience, our own fascination, our own possession. Human nature wants to witness, but it does not always know how to witness without taking. That is why the painting remains morally alive. It does not flatter us with the assumption that we are automatically on the side of compassion. It asks whether our sympathy can survive the seduction of spectacle. It asks whether, when faced with beauty made vulnerable, we can refrain from converting dignity into consumption. This question is ancient, but it also feels painfully modern, because modern life has multiplied opportunities to look without responsibility. The legend names a truth we still live with: when one person is exposed, others will claim the right to see. There is another element of human nature revealed here, and it is more difficult still, the strange alliance between shame and power. Shame is usually imagined as weakness, as the collapse of selfhood under judgment. But in this painting, shame, or something near it, becomes the medium of agency. Godiva does not seem shameless. She does not transcend the fact of exposure through indifference. On the contrary, her modesty is what gives the act its cost. She feels enough to make the sacrifice real. And yet, because she accepts that cost freely, the meaning of shame is altered. What should diminish her becomes, paradoxically, the measure of her moral force. This is one of the most profound insights embedded in the image. Human beings are not powerful only when armored, commanding, or invulnerable. Sometimes they are most powerful when they consent to a vulnerability that serves something beyond the self. This does not romanticize suffering. It does not say that humiliation is good. It says only that the human soul has, on rare occasions, the capacity to transmute personal exposure into public witness. We recognize this withal because it is not common. It runs against our instinct for concealment, comfort, and pride. Most of us would rather protect our image than imperil it for others. Most of us negotiate with conscience until it asks less of us. Lady Godiva, in the legend and in Collier's rendering, is frightening precisely because she does not negotiate. And then there is fear, the quiet companion of all these things. Fear of disgrace. Fear of being seen. Fear of defying power. Fear of misinterpretation. Fear that sacrifice will change nothing. Fear that the crowd, even if absent, is still present in imagination. The painting does not depict fear dramatically, yet it is present in the atmosphere like cold weather. To move forward under such fear is one definition of courage, but courage here is stripped of many of its familiar heroic ornaments. There is no battle, no proclamation, no weapon, no crowd cheering. There is only motion through silence. This may be why the image feels so intimate. It reveals human nature not at the level of collective drama but at the level of inward ordeal. We each know, in smaller ways, what it means to cross into a moment we would rather avoid because conscience leaves us no honorable alternative. We know the loneliness of necessary action. We know the temptation to let someone else bear the burden. We know the rationalizations that bloom whenever cost approaches. In Lady Godiva, these private truths take visible form. The legend is old, the costume medieval, the painter Victorian, yet the inner situation remains recognizable, to care enough to suffer, to see enough to feel responsible, to move forward without certainty of being understood. Human nature is revealed not only in the crowd that may stare, nor only in the ruler who taxes, but in the solitary rider who chooses to become answerable to the pain of others. That choice is rare. That rarity is why we remember it. And that memory is why the painting continues to unsettle the heart long after the eye has looked away. Chapter 8: Why it still speaks today. A painting survives across generations not because every detail remains current, but because its deepest tensions migrate easily into new times. Lady Godiva still speaks today because we are not as far from Coventry as we imagine. The forms have changed. Streets have become screens, pageants have become feeds, the public square has become both more dispersed and more relentless. Yet the central questions persist. What does a society do with vulnerable visibility? What happens when one person's body becomes the site of a moral message? How easily does witness become an intrusion? How quickly does admiration become consumption? In an age saturated with images, these questions feel sharper, not weaker. We live amidst constant acts of looking. We are trained to scan, react, enlarge, circulate, comment, archive. Exposure travels instantly now, and what once might have been a local scandal or a civic legend becomes global material in moments. This should make Collier's painting feel obsolete. Instead, it makes it eerily prophetic. Its silence stands against our speed. Its modesty stands against our compulsive disclosure. Its ethics of looking stand against our assumption that visibility confers public ownership. Lady Godiva's passage through Coventry begins to resemble every modern situation in which dignity must pass through the marketplace and hope not to be destroyed there. The painting also speaks because the idea of sacrifice remains deeply unstable in contemporary consciousness. We praise selflessness, but we distrust moral theater. We admire courage, but we suspect performance. We celebrate vulnerability, but only within carefully managed languages. Lady Godiva disrupts all of that because her act resists clean categorization. It is public but not self-promotional. It is embodied but not exhibitionist. It is political in effect but not ideological in vocabulary. It is intimate and civic at once. Modern culture struggles with such acts because it prefers visible motives, explicit messaging, or easily sorted identities. Collier's Godiva offers none of those comforts. She does not announce herself. She does not brand her suffering. She does not narrate her own meaning. She simply moves. That movement, precisely because it is so underexplained, feels increasingly rare. We are surrounded by declarations, statements, captions, defenses, and strategies of interpretation. The painting returns us to a more difficult mode of understanding, one in which moral seriousness is carried by bearing rather than by commentary. This is why it still reaches modern viewers who may know little of Coventry, less of Leafrag, and almost nothing of Anglo-Saxon monastic history. The emotional truth arrives before the facts do. A person enters public space under a burden. The act is misunderstood or vulnerable to misunderstanding. Beauty complicates sympathy. Silence deepens danger. Conscience proceeds anyway. Nothing about that pattern is historically exhausted. There is also a specifically contemporary resonance in the painting's treatment of feminine visibility. Modern discourse often swings between empowerment and objectification as if they were exhaustive categories, yet Lady Godiva does not sit comfortably in either. She is not empowered in the simplistic sense of commanding the gaze, nor objectified in the passive sense of surrendering to it. She inhabits a more difficult region where agency and vulnerability coexist. That coexistence feels truer to many lived realities than our flatter vocabularies allow. The painting acknowledges that visibility can be chosen and still dangerous, morally serious and still misread, dignified and still exposed to exploitation. This makes it strikingly relevant to a world in which women, especially, continue to navigate public spaces that promise recognition while often delivering scrutiny. Collier's image does not resolve that contradiction. It preserves it, and in preserving it, it remains honest. The work also speaks to contemporary exhaustion with spectacle. Viewers today are skilled at recognizing when emotion has been overstated or manufactured. Lady Godiva offers an opposite experience. Its restraint becomes radical. It does not scream its importance. It trusts stillness. It trusts the intelligence of the viewer enough to let ambiguity remain intact. In a noisy age, that trust feels almost medicinal. The painting becomes a place where one can think slowly again. And then there is the question of communal mercy, which is perhaps the oldest and newest of all. The legend tells of a plea for relief from heavy taxation, a noblewoman interceding for townspeople burdened by power. However embroidered the story became over time, the underlying moral desire is recognizable, that those closest to power might use their vulnerability, influence, or voice to ease the suffering of others. Every age has its versions of this wish. We continue to hope for figures who will risk comfort, reputation, or safety on behalf of the unseen or overburdened. We continue to distrust systems that ask much from the many and little from the protected few. We continue to tell stories in which conscience crosses the distance that institutions refuse to cross on their own. This is why Lady Godiva does not remain sealed in medieval romance or Victorian aestheticism. She steps into our present because the human arrangement that produced her legend still persists in altered forms. There are still burdens unequally borne. There are still public tests of private courage. There are still spectators who mistake access for entitlement. There are still acts of care that can only be performed at personal cost. And so the painting continues to speak, not as a relic but as a mirror softened by time, one in which our own age sees itself with surprising clarity and, perhaps for a moment, with unusual humility. Chapter 9: The Uncomfortable Realization. At some point, if we stay with the painting long enough, admiration gives way to discomfort. This is not because the work fails, but because it succeeds too completely. We begin by honoring Lady Godiva. We may speak inwardly of courage, sacrifice, serenity, the dignity of the bowed head, the nobility of moral conviction. All of this is true enough. But sooner or later another awareness enters, quieter and harder to escape. The painting depends upon the very tension it seems to purify. It asks us to contemplate a woman whose exposure is meaningful only because exposure remains dangerous. Without the risk of being seen wrongly, there would be no legend. Without the vulnerability of the body to misreading, there would be no sacrifice to admire. The image is therefore built upon an instability it cannot abolish. It can ennoble the scene, deepen it, slow it, consecrate it with atmosphere, but it cannot wholly save it from the ancient problem of sight. This is the uncomfortable realization. Even in a painting of exceptional restraint, beauty and vulnerability still attract the gaze. Reverence may temper that gaze, but it does not erase it. We are implicated from the first moment. To look is already to enter the moral difficulty the legend describes. This realization unsettles because it breaks the easy division between innocence and corruption. It would be convenient if Peeping Tom alone bore the stain of improper sight and the rest of us could stand with clean consciences among the respectful townspeople behind closed shutters. But Collier's compositional intelligence denies us that comfort. By largely removing the explicit violator from the scene, he prevents the corruption from being safely outsourced to a single character. The drama returns to the viewer. We must ask not only whether we admire Godiva, but what kind of attention our admiration takes. Do we value her because she enacted mercy, or because the form of that mercy passes through beauty? Would the legend endure with equal force if the scene was stripped of grace, whiteness, flowing hair, and aesthetic harmony? This question does not negate the painting's greatness. It clarifies its danger. Human beings often discover their highest ideals entangled with their least innocent appetites. Art is one of the privileged places where that entanglement becomes visible. We do not simply love virtue. We love virtue when it appears in radiant form, when it can be seen, when it is made emotionally and visually compelling. There is no shame in recognizing this, only humility. The shame lies in pretending otherwise. Collier's painting, for all its delicacy, does not let us remain naive about how moral emotion and aesthetic pleasure cooperate inside us. There is another discomfort as well, perhaps even deeper. Lady Godiva's act is admirable precisely because it is exceptional, and the exceptional has a way of exposing ordinary cowardice. Most people do not ride out invisible vulnerability for the sake of others. Most people bargain with conscience, delay, rationalize, lower the cost, or applaud from the sidelines when someone else takes the risk. The painting is difficult because it does not accuse us loudly, it simply shows an act of costly pity and leaves us alone with our own measure. We may admire her, but can we